Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tai Chi Notebook podcast. In this episode I'm talking to Ethan Murchie, who is a member of the North American Tang Shou Dao Association. Podcast we talk about his teacher Vince Black, from whom he learned xing mixed with elements of Sufism and Shamanism, as well as how the association is doing today. We also cover the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, which Ethan teaches through his Living Neijing website. We also talk about the meaning of different Chinese terms, as well as his Tai Chi teacher, Liang Dehua, and the Yang Shao Hao lineage of Yang family Tai Chi. So, without further ado, here he is. Thanks for reaching out via email. That was very, very handy of you.
Yeah, well, like I said, after I was listening to some of your podcasts, I was just like, these guys, some of the people you talk to are my peers. I was like, I should be part of this conversation too. My family of Gong Fu people have been kind of very private for a long time. And I think it's a little bit of a shame that especially my teacher's not more well known. So I was like, I should reach out and see if I can join in.
Yeah. Do you mean your teacher, Vince Black?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to just tell us a bit about how you met up with him and how you started training with him?
We'll see. That's cool. This is a kind of a story. It really sounds a bit larger than life in the end of the day. But I had started training Tai Chi when I was about 18 years old. Yeah. And that was really, it was because I had a thing when I was 13, I suffered a thing called a spontaneous pneumothorax. Have any idea what that is? It means my lung collapsed for sort of no reason. It tore a hole tore in the wall of my lung, and then it collapsed. Basically, it happens to tall, skinny white guys is the main sufferers of this. So I had grown like a foot in 1 year, and my lungs just couldn't grow fast enough. And so I got the wind knocked out of me, and it caused my lung to sort of self-destruct. And so then I had a big surgery, which messed me up quite a bit. And I guess it saved my life, but I was pretty, not very healthy afterwards. So I was trying to figure out how to get healthy again. And by luck, I was trying lots of different stuff, and I tried Tai Chi, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. By luck at that time, the guy that I wound up studying Tai Chi with was a direct student of Huang Shencheng from Taiwan, which I had no idea about any of this kind of thing at the time, but it turns out that was a pretty neat connection to make at that time. And he did some chi stuff to me, which blew my mind. I was like, this is not supposed to exist. He kind of beamed chi at me from a couple of feet away. And I know that's a contentious topic for lots of people, but this was just an experience that I had at 18 years old, totally unsuspecting. And I was like, whoa, what was that? So I was really hooked on Tai Chi, but I started looking at the literature about Tai Chi, and it said it's a martial art. So I was like, where's the martial art part? I'm not getting it. I really like this weird chi stuff. It's really tripping me out, but it says it's a martial art. And I grew up in a place that was fairly rough or whatever. Violence was a fairly common occurrence. So I was very, very aware of what a fight is like. And I was like, this is not convincing me any kind of martial intent going on here at all. So I was searching around for an answer. There's a solution to this conundrum of Tai Chi is supposed to be a martial art. And at that time, there was a publication called the Pakhua Journal.
Yeah, I'm aware of that one. It was before I got interested in these things, but everyone keeps talking about it as the definitive sort of guide to what was going on at the time.
Yeah, it was. I think literally it was just pre-internet. So it was like trying to do something that would happen on the internet today, but just pre-internet. So the guy who did it, his name was Dan Miller, and he actually did a lot of work with Vince. They partnered up a lot of their trips to China and finding people to interview and that kind of stuff they did together. But in the Pakhua Journal, I read them all, and there was a few people in North America who looked interesting, and it turned out Vince was one of the more interesting ones because he had made a lot of very commonsensical statements about internal boxing. It sounded very straightforward and realistic. And I had also heard rumors through the grapevine that he had this organization where people occasionally got together and fought to test out their arts. And then after fighting, then they all sat down and had a beer together. And I was like, oh, that sounds really good. And then this is the part that's a little bit mystical. It turned out that Vince's headquarters and where he was teaching everything was about a mile down the road from my grandparents' house in Arizona. So I grew up in Canada, but long story, my grandparents were Arizonans. So I was like, whoa, this guy who's like a kind of like a kung fu master, a Xinyi Bagua master is right down the road from my grandparents' house. So that's the obvious place to start. I went down there it was easy to go, and I went, and I that was basically it. I came to check it out, and then I stayed for about 5 years straight after that. I was just pretty much hooked. When I went, I came just to I wanted to learn Tai Chi, but he was like, well, we don't really have Tai Chi classes. We just have Xingyi and Bagua classes. So I was like, okay, I don't know what that is really, but I knew about Bagua a bit because of the connection with the Neijing. I had been another strange part of my young life was that I found a copy of the Neijing on my father's bookshelf when I was about 12 and became totally obsessed with throwing the coins and reading what it said. So so when I saw there was a martial art based on that, I was like, well, that's interesting. But that was all I knew about it, and I knew nothing about Xingyi. But I came down there, so I was like, okay, I'll do whatever you say, and that was that.
It's weird that these days it's really like a Chingy class is like finding gold, isn't it? It's like it's so rare, and Tai Chi is everywhere.
Yep.
But
Well,
it's crazy that he did it the other way around.
yeah, it's because the reason for that I think is because he had a whole what I call a whole system of Xingyi. The Xingyi that we call Shenlong Xingyi, which comes through a guy named Shuangji in Taiwan, who Shuangji was a student of Hong Yishang, who was a student of Zhang Zhongfeng.
Right.
So that whole thing, the sort of Yizhong Bagua, same family of people. And they have a particularly really interesting history right there because it grew up in Taiwan, sort of disconnected from the previous generations of people in China. And Taiwan, if you know, was at that time had just finished being ruled by the Japanese for 50 years. And it's that island with a lot of sort of mercantile activity, and there's this whole mixing pot of cultures. So they really took stuff from everywhere and put it into their system. So we say it's Xingyi, but actually, if you come as a raw beginner, you're going to do a whole bunch of stuff that's calisthenic conditioning, and then things sort of like judo. We have a tumbling and falling routine, which I've seen videos of people in Japan doing exactly the same routine. Like they got it from some Japanese people from a judo school or something like that. And all this stuff mixed together. And then it's only after maybe a year or more that you would actually start to do classical Xingyi, Pichuan and Santi and that kind of stuff. And if you again look at the history in Taiwan, Hong Yishang's main goal in his creating the system was to win fights. That was what it was to do. He win. And so there's a lot of things you have to practice to be able to win fights that are not strictly internal martial arts, right?
Yeah, conditioning for one.
Exactly. Conditioning is a big part of it, right? Exactly. Yeah. So that'd be it. Like if you came for our Xingyi classes, the first thing you do is a lot of conditioning, a lot of sit-ups and push-ups and tumbling and other kind of somewhat strange other kinds of calisthenic exercises. What's beautiful about it to me is that it's all strength and conditioning, but done in a way so that it won't contradict the eventual development of like quote unquote internal skills.
Okay. Yeah.
It's specifically designed like that. I mean, it essentially in a nutshell means everything is really carefully coordinated with breath work. So you're always breathing with your movements and doing these full ranges of motion and stuff so that you don't get tight and crunched up. It to be strong and tough because you need to be able to kind of open and loose to be able to do the internal parts. But that was all in response to your question about Tai Chi and Xingyi, or your comment about Tai Chi and Xingyi. Vince would teach Xingyi first because he has his whole system. Tai Chi basically had a form, and his form was the Cheng Man Ching short form. And after that, he kind of made it work for him very martially, but that's because he was a bit of a genius like that. He would make anything work. But teaching it to someone else, he had no real method to teach it. Whereas with the Xingyi and the Bagua, we have these whole methods to teach it.
Yeah, from beginners all the way up, rather than
exactly.
I mean, I've heard that before about these Taiwan systems. The Tai Chi is the kind of the thing they teach at the end, because you've already been through a process where you've developed skills, rather than starting with the Tai Chi and then not having any sort of entry point for beginners.
That's been my experience. I don't know about a lot of other Taiwanese systems, but that's the way our system is set up. Absolutely. It's again sort of mirroring this idea of this very cosmopolitan culture in Taiwan. It's a very cosmopolitan kind of art. It has you can obviously see the influences from all over the place.
Yeah, so this is still taught in America under the Vince's association that he set up, which is because unfortunately he's passed away since.
Correct.
But there's the I'll murder the pronunciation, the Tang Shou.
Tang Shou Dao, we say usually.
Tang Shou Dao. Yeah.
Correct.
So Tang as in like Tang Dynasty meaning Chinese.
That's right.
Shou as in hand, Dao way.
That's it.
So it's the Chinese hand way, which is the same kind of thing karate means, isn't it? Which is the Chinese hand way. You know?
It's exactly the same. It just means like empty-handed fighting arts. Chinese empty-handed fighting arts. I mean, you have it in Korea too. Tang Shou Dao. It's a very generic term.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's interesting with Chinese stuff because sometimes it's all very poetic, you know, and then other times it's very functional. It's just like the name of this is what it says on the tin, you know.
No, exactly. And oftentimes the parts that we think are so poetical for Chinese people, it's very prosaic. It's just the way they've been calling something for thousands of years, so they just keep doing it.
Yeah, Tai Chi forms are a bit like that too. There's like, you know, to embrace the tiger, return to the mountain, then there's hit on the left or just something like that next to it, you know.
Yeah, and my experience is that a lot of times these names and stuff come just like commonsensically, like as if you and I are training together and we need to call that thing something, and we're like, "Do you remember what we learned? What it was called?" We're like, "No, let's call it hit to the left."
Call it this, yeah. Yes. You mentioned that Vince had a way about his Shingi that was leaning towards the shamanic aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said to you in our communication there, we never, or it was kind of rare that he would overtly talk about shamanism linked with Xingi. That it was not so much that it was just not his language, like the way he thought about it, but the connection really came from that it was about the fighting part was kind of secondary, even though we just talked about how the system is all designed to teach you how to fight and be tough enough to fight and stuff. But we also got this phrase from Shuangji, which he says, fighting is easy. Anyone can learn to do it in 3 months. Therefore, we're not really here about the fighting. We're here for something else.
Yeah.
And so Vince was really into that. And so the fighting was really important because it was sort of the medium by which we're learning things. But the learning is about changing the way you are inside your heart and mind and the way you are in the world. And that is done by the reason the martial arts or the fighting is such a good medium for it is like the way I understand the shamanism, that it's you trying to get this direct feed with reality and learn to sort of bypass all the construct that you have in your mind, which is kind of fake. What do you guys call it in the Heretics podcast?
Has to be called the miasma.
The miasma, exactly. You're trying to bypass the miasma by this direct experience, which in the context of fighting is, we talk about this martial truth. Every time, if you and I take some competition, we push on each other or punch each other or whatever, there's a moment there where there's a true moment. Like it's just true. There's
reality
around it. Yeah. And so you can learn to kind of get the flavor of the truth from that and then learn to see it in all the other places where it's not so obvious and hitting you in the face. So, and the goal again is to make people sort of grow up, learn to recognize and work with their weak points and to, polish off the rough bits and basically become the best version of themselves. And so that is where it gets kind of shamanistic. Plus the fact that he was just generally, he would self-describe as a mystic for sure. He was like, I'm a mystic. That's what I'm here for. So everything he was looking at was sort of not worldly. He was always looking and thinking and talking about this layer of things going on behind what everyone else was obsessed with as daily real life or whatever.
I mean, a lot of my teacher Damon's Shingi is to do with the animals. There's the 12 animals of Shingi, and obviously that has some sort of shamanic connection too, because connecting to animals and things like that is quite a preoccupation of shamanic arts. So did Vince look at it that way too?
Absolutely. This was a major part of it. Like he was sort of building up a way of working with it, and this was an ongoing process. It wasn't something that just he had already prepackaged or something.
Hmm.
But it was about, he would say, like, if, what you want to be able to do with your teaching is take someone who's really like timid and getting kind of rolled over by life and have them use forms like the tiger form to make them become more big and be able to take up more space. And then someone who's already overbearing and railroading everyone, have them have to work with snake or something so they get more flexible and able to adapt to things. He was definitely always thinking along these kinds of lines. He also had a thing we would spend a lot of time on about that the way we move affects the way we can think. And this is from animals on up to us. So, this whole thing of evolutionary movement patterns and the way we sort of, starting as babies, we have like little worm and snake-like movements, and then we learn to crawl and do the reptile kind of movements, and then we get more mammalian, and then we finally stand up and are human or whatever. We spent a lot of time working on those kinds of movement patterns and trying to ascertain how they're making us think differently.
Yeah. It's weird though, because if you kind of mention anything to do with shamanic activity or anything to do with China's martial arts today, you kind of get just sort of either ignored or laughed out of town.
Oh.
These arts were meant to be designed for fighting. What are you talking about? But then the more you look into it, the more you find out there's so many people who are into this stuff that the great masters of the older times were very into this kind of stuff as well.
I think it's because of this thing we said that Master Shou said that fighting's easy. Anyone can learn to do it in 3 months. Like, yeah, we got to maintain this martial reality, but you don't spend your lifetime learning to beat people up better and better. You get over that phase fairly quickly. Yeah. So then you're into using it for something like more profound, which is understanding life, understanding reality, all these very interesting things.
Yeah, there's a lot more depth to that kind of the side of things, isn't there? I remember also when I started Tai Chi thinking, because the guys I learned off they had this sort of like self-defense curriculum too, which was I think it's based on Japanese jiu-jitsu, and it was all things to do with like dealing with people grabbing you from behind or grabbing your arm, and it's just like set responses really. A large part of it was to do with how to deal with like real life situations, and it became very apparent that there wasn't that much you needed to do really. You needed to hit them and keep on hitting them, then run away. No. And then I remember thinking, okay, I'm bored of that now. Like I don't think it goes deeper than that really, And then there's all this other stuff. So obviously we're here for, it's quite obvious we're here for something else. I like that way of looking at it.
I relate to this, what you described exactly. I've actually trained quite a lot of that kind of self-defense, sort of dealing with violence type of method. And exactly, there's a thing there though about dealing with the emotions around confrontation and physical aggressions and violence and fears and things like that. And there's also a really interesting thing that was, again, part of Vince's kind of shamanistic outlook on these arts. When we did those self-defense type of trainings, and in our context, our framework was this thing called Kaju Kembo karate. Have you ever heard of that? It's a Hawaiian thing, basically what you described, but has a specific lineage.
Yeah.
So Vince's goal when getting people through the self-defense curriculum was, he would say, about hormones in the endocrine system. He wanted you to be able to turn on like a really high level of violence and like kind of evil ability when you had to defend yourself. And that means like when the adrenaline floods into your system, it sets off a chain reaction, which involves becoming like kind of evil back at someone as opposed to freaking out. But then the rest of your life, not think about that at all. That was his main concern, was like, he's like, it's very easy to produce people who are really bad. And then they're just bad all the time and they become bad people. And that's like useless. So how do you produce people who are really self-defendable, but are nice people the rest of the time? That was one of his kind of projects, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, cool. So the association is still going, you're still teaching. Is it quite active?
It's active in its own, in a certain way, yeah. We have the typical kind of things that happen when you're kind of great leader passes on. Vince was definitely like tribal chieftain, kind of big man, and
holding it all together, right?
Yeah. And so it's gone through the typical kind of little dissolution that usually happens. Some people lose interest and there's a little bit of infighting and this kind of thing. But I think we survived that phase pretty well. And now, so it's shrunk a bit, but now the people who are still around and the training that's going on is quite excellent, quite focused and satisfying. We're also dealing with the sort of evolving into the future. You look back, especially I look back at the beginning of Vince's work in the 70s and 80s, the world was really a different place. And like, where I live was a completely different, it's not comparable in any way. So the young people today who are coming up, they have different kind of motivations and the whole experience is different. So we're sort of consciously looking at that. How do we get people enthusiastic about training these kinds of arts, which again are not like the Brazilian jiu-jitsu kind of thing, and it's not MMA. So how do people relate to it? How do we find a way for people to understand how much enjoyment and benefit they can get out of it?
And what is that? What is? How do you see these arts existing in the future?
Well, I think my first thing is that we all have a tendency when we're at that certain phase of our life, we want to see it be successful, in air quotes, successful and grow big and have lots of students and all this kind of stuff. And there's maybe something to that, but at the same time, I think these arts are not so often really big, mass-produced arts like that. It's more about small groups of people doing the art for the art's sake. And in this way, I think this is why I say like we've kind of shrunk as an association, but the work that's being done is very satisfying. It's like that we managed to keep finding the small groups of people that are interested. So what's the benefit? I mean, what was your question again? Like
how do you see these arts existing in the future? I mean, everything goes in cycles, right? So in the 70s, Kung Fu, etc., was huge. And then it kind of dipped off, and then karate appeared in the 80s, then ninjutsu, and then in the 90s, you kind of get into UFC and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and everything goes in waves. I mean, I can see Kung Fu coming back at some point, definitely in the future. But I just wondered how you saw the sort of things that you teach, whether they have a place in the modern world or whether they need to be adapted in certain ways to fit in.
I think they need to adapt, but I don't know. It's not like they need to adapt. They just are going to evolve or change or something like this a little bit. The biggest challenge that I see is that the sort of environment of physical confrontation and conflict is, at least in North America right now, it's not that necessary to learn these kind of, really invest in these kind of skills to a deep level. And so how do we it's not so hard to find people who are enthusiastic about we could say like the meditative or the self-development aspects of it, but they become progressively like diluted and thinned out without some kind of the martial reality. And they're not people that I'm in contact with on a regular basis. They don't get this martial reality by living in a dangerous place. So how do you get it? This is, and again, if you go to the MMA or whatever, you don't get it either, right? Because that's a specific kind of sporting endeavor. It's people always kind of make fun of the traditional martial arts, saying, "Oh, I couldn't do that in the MMA because it's too dangerous. I'm too bad to be able to do it." Which obviously there's a way of saying that which is really cheesy. But if your techniques are designed as self-defense techniques, then you can't actually practice them in a ring. So how do you manage this dynamic, right, of keeping it real, but acknowledging and leaning into the fact that the benefit is, as we were saying earlier, comes from this lifelong study of something which is really about yourself and about a personal growth, not about dominating other people. But you have to keep on practicing with the domination aspect, otherwise you lose the reality of it. It's a tricky.
I mean, I've talked to different people on this podcast, and people have different ideas about how the Chinese arts evolve into the future. Some are very much about sort of merging it into MMA. Some are like, well, it needs to go its own. Like you were saying, it's kind of like it's not one thing or the other. It's its own thing. Interesting. But talking about lifelong study and lifelong practice, that brings us rather nicely onto the topic of the Yellow Emperor's internal classic, which is something you've actually studied for a long time, and you have an online course about it, which is quite fascinating. Do you want to just give me the overview of that?
Yeah, for sure. So for me, the thing about the Neijing, so that's the Yellow Emperor's internal classic. In Chinese, it's called Huangdi Neijing. So I usually call it the Neijing. Is that so? Another back to our Gong Fu and our sort of lineage connection to Taiwan. Shuangji, the guy who said, fighting's easy, anyone can do it in 3 months. Another one of his statements to us that he kind of left for us to like guide practice is he said, if you want to be a teacher of Kung Fu, you'll never be more than half of one unless you know the medicine. So he was very clear about this. And on one hand, he was very practically oriented. It means if you're going to train hard, then people are going to get hurt. And if you don't know how to manage those injuries, you're not really taking responsibility for your group as a full teacher. But then it quickly leads on to understanding how to do that. Like you can learn techniques to treat a sprained ankle or a cracked rib or something like that, broken nose. Those are quite easy and straightforward to learn. But then they say, okay, well, you got to like move the chi in the blood. So what does moving chi and blood mean? Or things, if you have a tendon injury, then the tendons relate with the liver. And then so sour flavored things while you're trying to recover from your tendon injury are maybe not the best. So you get sucked into the actual medicine quite quickly. Like starting from that point, I was kind of paying attention. I was learning. Well, for me, when I came down to study with Vince, I was there for a year or so. And I saw that what he had for his life setup was he had an acupuncture Chinese medicine clinic and a Kung Fu school. And they're in the same building. And I was like, oh, this is great. Everyone else I see kind of goes to work in an office or something and then does Kung Fu afterwards. But this guy just is there all day long. It's like his whole life. I'm like, this is wonderful. So I asked if I could start learning the medicine from him at that point. And so that education was very practical. It was hands-on clinical stuff. You're helping in the clinic. And then at that time, the theoretical part, Vince was really kind of big on tradition or remembering, always looking back to where things came from. And so he's like, you got to study this Neijing book. But at that time, this was in the mid 1990s, there was none actually in English to read. There were not literally none, but very few translations that were not very good quality. So it was difficult, but we sort of stuck with it. And we hooked up with a guy named Nguyen Van Ghi, Dr. Van Ghi, who is a Vietnamese scholar, physician who lived in France. And he did a full translation of the book, The Neijing, into French. And we met with him a few times and he taught us some stuff and kind of, he confirmed it. He was like, if you want to call yourself an acupuncturist and you don't read the Neijing, then you're not. He's just like, it's long, like, he's just like, he was really hardcore. He's just like, forget it, you're just pretending. So this was even more sort of, okay, we really have to figure out how we can get our hands on this book in a way that we can actually use it. So then eventually I realized I really had to do that. So I ended up going to Taiwan and spending some time there and learning to speak Chinese reasonably well, and more so be able to read the classical Chinese so I could read the book myself. And then when I started to read it myself, I was like, holy moly, man, it kind of blew my mind because I realized that everything that my teachers have been saying, and not so much Vince, because Vince is American, so he spoke American. He would talk about the concepts, but they would come out in a very American language. But the Chinese teachers, and when I have been at this point to China many times and hung out with quite a few different Chinese teachers, all of them basically sounded like they were quoting from the Neijing when they were describing the theories and the whys and wherefores of internal boxing. It's super clear when you have the language that there's this big crossover between the two.
Yeah, that's amazing because I'd always just assumed it was. I know there's two halves to it. There's the questions and answers bit at the start, and then there's the acupuncture stuff. I just assumed it was all a medical text and had no relevance to martial arts at all, but that's completely false.
That is not true, exactly. And actually the Neijing itself, I believe, was just like a specific focused on medicine text within a larger corpus of works that were about like really life in general. A lot about politics and organizing society and running everything in a way that's optimizing the thriving of your society. That was a lot of the work that they were doing back then. But so now back to the Neijing and Kung Fu stuff, and particularly Xing. So the specific framework which the Neijing uses is the wuxing, the 5 phases, as a core. And this is based on the seasons, essentially. So we have 4 seasons. The 5th one is a tricky philosophical conundrum to work on. But when they talk about the wuxing and the 5 phases, they're really talking about this cycle, which is the seasons, this sort of fundamental cycle as we move through time. And then you have the 12 channels, or the 6 qi. 6 qi are like the atmosphere or the environment, wind and heat and cold and damp. That they label with a 6. And then you double it to 12, it's still considered like in the same category. 12 and 6, they sort of go together. And so the 12 channels are on the outside of your body and your arms and your legs. There's 5 organs are on the inside of your body. And this mirrors the way in the bigger world you have this cycle, slow seasonal cycle of 5 movements, with the 6 more chaotic cycles of or changes in local environmental conditions. All this to say, then you look at Xing and you have your 5 fists and your 12 animals. It's not a coincidence that they have 5 and 12 instead of like 4 and 8 or something like that. It's very specifically modeled on the same sort of conceptual framework. And then, of course, when you get a bit more practical about it, it should be obvious to us all in the end. If you want to be a high-level performer of any kind of physical art, a sport or anything else in the modern world, then you know a lot about how you train, why you train, the way you train, the kind of medical aspects, sports physiology and sports science and exercise science. So why would we assume that the Chinese people were any different, and that 200 years ago their medical science was the Neijing? So if you wanted to train to a high level, of course you took all the ideas about how to train from your medical literature. So this is where the things combine together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Does it contain sort of advice on life as well as like training ideas and things?
It does. This is what I said earlier, that it's part of a sort of a larger corpus. And so the Neijing itself makes statements about like how to live life and how to think about things, but in a sort of it says it just like says it and assumes that you have access to the other literature. If you really want to get into that aspect, you can go look it up somewhere else, which of course we don't really have because it was 2,000 years ago that it was written.
So we've lost these other works, presumably.
Correct. Well, not all of them, but many of them are gone now. Yeah. So it doesn't get into a lot of details where it is a medically focused text. So it goes into the detail about the medical things, but it kind of says, life is like this and this and this. Therefore we will treat like this, right. And it again assumes that you can go look up if you want to think about the foundational thinking more. But there's enough clues in there, and especially when you combine it with practice. This is one of the really cool things, is that up till now, when Western people read the Neijing, it's kind of hard to do. You have to learn Chinese, you have to learn to read the classical Chinese. It's mostly more scholarly people that are doing it. And a lot of times they're kind of mystified. They scratch their head and they're like, what is this trying to say? But if you get up and train and do things like Xing, then you start to be like, oh, it's describing what I'm feeling. It becomes very obvious. So that's the other aspect that I'm most interested in at the moment, is examining the book from the point of view of someone who is training in some, I wouldn't want to say that I'm training the same way as people did 200 years ago in China, but there's a lot of crossover. Like I'm not so far off from the way they were training 20 years ago in China. And so that informs the way I see the book. And then reading the book informs the way that I'm thinking about the training. And it all kind of goes back and forth in this really lovely way.
Yeah. The book's like 2,000 years old, isn't it?
2,000 years old, yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you were seriously training 200 years ago, you would be using the book and
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
And the book we have now is not actually the one they had 2,000 years ago. The book we have now was compiled and put together into its current format in the Song Dynasty, so around 11 something.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the things that we call classic martial arts texts that we refer to aren't that old at all. They are sort of done from Sun Lutang's time onwards, which isn't that long ago, really. But obviously, those people would have had some texts that they were reading, which would have been the Neijing. So I guess these are the foundational texts of a lot of the things that we think of as Tai Chi classics that aren't that old.
No, absolutely. And this is like, even I think everyone that does internal martial arts relates to the idea of Jing Qi Shen, right? Regardless of how much we understand what they're talking about, what the heck they're trying to say, we all kind of know, like, we're working with Jing, with Qi, with Shen, but what does it mean? So back to a book like the Neijing, they're using that Jing, Qi, and Shen as the basis for medical treatments, which come back to the martial truth thing again, because there's like a medical truth too. If you're sick and I treat you, either it works or it doesn't work, right? We have a very hard bottom line to work with. And so these, I think in boxing, like when we talk about Jing Qi Shen, we're mostly our boxers or people that want to train and practice. We're not philosophers or academics or theoreticians, you know? So you have a certain base understanding that then you can apply to practice. But that base understanding is sort of taken from the people who are more academic and spent more time laying out this whole theory of what does these things actually mean, and then substantiating those theories through the practice of medicine, so that their theory is very easy, kind of quite easily verified. You know, it either works or it doesn't work.
So one of the texts that I really like is the thesis of Yu Fei, which is the Xingyi writing,
right?
Which gets a lot of hate because it has Yu Fei in the title, and everyone kind of goes, "Oh, yeah, it really had nothing to do with Xingyi at all." However, you're probably aware that David and I have done a 1,000,000-part series on Xingyi, which is up to about episode 13 of the thing.
I think it's even higher than that. But my only thing I could say about that is you should get back on it and do some more, because I'm waiting for the next installment.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, it's getting Damon's time is the we have so many series that we've started. Like we did the Chemical Wedding, and I finally got another episode of that out of him, which was really good. But we do need to get back on the Xingyi one. Yeah, in our last episode, we diverted into discussing Bung Chuan, or Bung, as he likes to, doesn't like the Chuan on the end, and that in its own is another 2 episodes. So we might have to just jump back to the history one and put a few episodes in there. But anyway, the point I was making was that, you know, the idea that Yu Fei was associated with Xingyi is not fanciful. There is plenty of historical evidence to kind of tie the real historical character up to the martial art. I mean, not in a Confucian style, this guy taught this guy lineage, but in a sense of ideas from that time are sort of flowing down to the people that were making the martial art. So is there much crossover between the 10 Theses and the Yellow Emperor's internal classic?
To be totally, I'm not totally familiar with this 10 Theses that you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah. All right. But it's interesting because it's from the time of the Song Dynasty, and it's kind of using ancient language, but it's describing martial arts. It's just specifically martial arts. So that's quite interesting to me.
No, I'm very enthusiastic about this. I love finding new little bits of information, and I kind of see it as a big puzzle. So when I get a new piece of the puzzle, I'm pretty happy about it. So I'm going to go look into these 10 Theses for sure.
There are plenty of books that have it in as well. Like there's Yang Zhiming, his Xingyi book has got some translations of it. He actually has the Chinese characters in, which we're more used to you than me, because you can read those, whereas they're no use to me. So I'm just reliant on, and there's so many different translations of it. They're all slightly different, you know.
But I confidently predict that I will find that indeed there's a lot of crossover with the.
Yeah, I think that the Jing Sheng your Qi sort of, I think that idea is in there as well, which, you know, is ancient.
This is like the work you and Damon have done with that whole history of Xingyi with Yue Fei connection. To me, it was very wonderful, because I being a Xingyi man was just happy to be like, I don't care what you say. Yeah, Yue Fei is the founder, you know?
Yeah.
But then the way the actual history that you guys lay out makes it be like, okay, clear. It's not fanciful. It's very, very realistic. And that whole thing with the Li, that Li movement, the work on the principle and the sort of working with the patterns of nature around us.
Yeah, patterns of nature.
This is what the Neijing is, exactly what the Neijing is about. And like I say, the copy that we have now, the sort of version that we have now, came out of the Song dynasty as well. So it all sort of came from the same kind of burst of creativity or whatever at that time. And this brings us back to this shamanistic stuff, because it's this thing of taking from the patterns around us, paying very close attention to how they are changing and moving, and devising your way of thinking and your way of applying on those rather than on made up stuff, as you guys call it, the miasma.
Yeah. The miasma is such a tricky, kind of topic here with this. It's such a tricky thing to nail down, because I've met so many people who talk about miasma, not aware that they are in fact in it. Even everybody's in it, so like we have to just accept that we're in it, and we can't, unless you go off and live on a mountain and never talk to anyone and live in nature. We are all part of this sort of society, so we can't get away from it.
No, and so then back to our xing and kung fu schools, kung fu studying, and related directly to this idea that you're in this thing, that this miasma that is so hard to see because you're in it. So how do you see it? The one of the first things that happened to me when I came to study with Vince after 6 or 8 months, he was a pretty big guy. Like, I don't mean physically big, but I mean he had his big presence, and he attracted a lot of followers. He was very, very, very good at what he did. His martial arts were quite mind blowing to many people. So he attracted people. And after I'd been there for 6 or 8 months, he gave me a book. It's called Learning How to Learn, by a guy named Shou, who is it's a Sufi thing. But Shou is a really interesting guy. He was a hereditary prince in Afghanistan, but his father had been sent to England to get educated and ended up marrying a woman from Scotland. And so he was born with a Scottish mother and an Afghani father.
Right.
And then when he was a grown up, he was tasked specifically to lay out this Sufi teaching in a way that was for late 20th century Westerners. And this is something that I see all the time. You can relate very much when we're talking about like Tai Chi, for example, or Xing. We have this information that got transmitted from China, and a lot of the information was kind of patchy, but it was really exciting. And a lot of people spent a lot of time investing in pretty weird stuff because it was so foreign, and the transmission was just weird, but it was exciting too. So we really got into it. I guess I'm diverging a little bit here, but with Tai Chi, we have the Peng Lu Ji An, and just the fact that the way those were translated since the 1970s just confused the whole thing. Like, when I started learning, I couldn't possibly learn to do those techniques properly because we were calling them push and press and ward off and roll back and everything,
Yeah.
So this kind of thing is what's going on. And this guy Idris Shah, he was tasked with trying to make an explanation or an exposition about Sufi thinking for Western people that was not all caught up in that weird mystical, like, half transmission stuff. And what I think the way he describes the Sufis, their mission is to help people realize they're in this miasma. Okay. And how do you escape from it?
Yeah.
And so this first book that he had was called Learning How to Learn. And in itself was a really interesting thing, because he had published a book called The Sufis, which was a very scholarly academic book, and caused a humongous splash in the early 1960s, because it kind of single-handedly destroyed the field of Islamic or Sufi studies within academic institutions. Because he was like, this is actually, you guys are kind of making it all up. This is what actually happened. And so after this book came and made a big splash, then many people wrote him letters. I think he said he got like 4,000 letters asking different questions. And then he took that and compiled it into this book, Learning How to Learn, where he's like, here's a question that got asked like 300 times. Here's the answer. And he goes through and talks about it. It's really this idea of the miasma and the way you're trapped in the way you think and can't see your own processes. It's a lot about that. And the reason I'm talking about it at such length is because after I'd been training in this school with a bunch of people surrounding this like big martial arts master, he gave me this book to look at, to read, and I read it. And then I was like, holy moly, this is all real. Like everything it's describing is happening around me. I'm seeing it. It's saying like, why is someone actually there studying? Are they there to learn what we're actually teaching? Or are they there because they want to be close to the teacher? Or are they there because they don't have any other friends and they want to come to class to hang out? All these different reasons why people are doing, which they're not there. If you ask them, they're there to learn xing, but really, why are they there? These kind of things. And this, I think, is back to the shamanism, right? It's about learning to see below the surface of things and the way things are going on behind the scenes, and also the patterns that keep reproducing. These patterns of nature are patterns. We're part of nature, so it's in us too. So that's back to at the beginning. We were talking about Vincent, his way of shamaning. That is an example. He's like, look at what's going on. I've sort of produced this group of people. Now you can use them to understand more about life, because you can see this sort of microcosm of life happening in the Xing school.
Interesting. I mean, there's two things I want to just circle back to with you. One is I want to know what you think about Qi, because you've mentioned it a couple of times now, and I think you've got opinions. So I'd like to hear them. And then I'd also like to know about, if we've got time, I don't know how long you've got, but if we can talk about Tai Chi a little bit, because I'm really interested to know what you think about Peng Lu Jian, because I think you've got opinions about that too. So,
okay. Qi is easy. Actually, it's super easy, because if you speak a bit of Chinese, then you see how this term is used in Chinese. And Chinese people will say different things about it, but my opinion is it comes down to, you use Qi to describe things which are obviously there, but are hard to grasp. In other words, like the air. We all are breathing in air. It's full of oxygen. We know it's happening, but you can't get the air, unless you have some high-tech special scientific stuff, like to compress the oxygen into a tank and stuff, which we can do today. But in the past, you knew that there was something you were breathing in. If you didn't get it, you were going to die. But how do you describe it? It's a bunch of molecules, oxygen molecules. So that's Qi. And that extrapolates into just anything that you need to talk about, which you can't just itemize. You can just
show anything you can't just show to somebody. I guess.
Yeah. Or we're talking about doing internal martial arts. There's all these feelings.
Yeah.
And they're somewhat reproducible in a lot of cases. If you do the practice, we all do the practice, we're all going to get a similar kind of feeling. So we all try to song chen, release and sink. We're all going to get this feeling of heaviness. So we can just talk about sink the Qi.
Sink the Qi, yeah.
And that's all it is. There's nothing else to it other than that. And yes, there is something that we have an electromagnetic field that your body produces, and you can do some little tricks with it and, make people have weird sensations and stuff. But again, and then we have to call that Qi because it's the same thing, right? Something you can't
see. Yeah.
Right.
So how does that relate to your, obviously you've got a lot of acupuncture knowledge. And so why does it need channels to flow down?
Well, so this is the thing you got to realize there, is that the Qi is the commander of the blood, and the blood is the mother of the Qi. Boom. They're inseparably linked together, blood and Qi. So why does it need channels to flow down? It's because the blood has
to flow somewhere, right?
Exactly. But then the full functioning of your arm, say, involves blood in the vessels, like in the actual veins and arteries. It also involves blood that's in the interstitial spaces. It also involves lymphatic fluids. It also involves nerves with nerve signal. All that combined together, again, even though we can say all those words now, like we can dissect someone enough and use medical imaging to sort of be able to label all that stuff. But your actual functioning arm, you still have to talk about the Qi in it, because you can't use it by labeling all those parts.
Yeah.
So the using it involves all these sensations that you end up having to label Qi. That's what it comes down.
So you still need to use the word Qi.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I use it all the time.
Because it's like a shortcut for, you don't want to have to do a whole anatomy class to explain the feeling you're.
Exactly. And also, if we get some things we can label, like your the parts of your physical arm. But if we start getting into the way it really feels to you, and we're trying to describe something like a way of, there's a way of, like in Tai Chi, you can make this kind of strength by extending your arms, your tissues, like stretching your tendons, and therefore it stretches the muscles. So it's not a contracting force, it's this extending force, right? And in practicing to do that, how are we going to talk about it? And if I try to describe every little detail of how my arm feels when I do it, this is likely not going to work for you because you feel things all slightly differently. Everything about you is a little bit different than it is me. So if we get too fixated on all these little detail, dissect, we lose our ability to even talk about it. So we just say, extend your arm and send the chi out to the tips of your fingers, and we're both happy. We both do it, and we're good.
I mean, you can, that's like, you see that in Aikido all the time, don't you? You just extend chi, but it produces a physical action of somebody putting their hand out in an opening, expansive way rather than in a contracting sort of like tension punch way, doesn't it?
That's it, exactly. And even there, we would just talk about, if we were really, using the language, we're just going to talk about that contracted kind of force. We're just going to say it's like tight chi. The chi is tight, or we just, it's still chi. Like it's the thing. You can use it for almost everything, and just don't get hung up on it. It's not anything weird and mystical. The problem is that there is some weird and mystical things that happen, and those are also, we got to use the term chi. So.
You mentioned that guy, the first guy you went to.
Exactly.
Healing. He was projecting.
He did push hands without touching, and you clearly felt this like sort of beam of quote unquote energy coming into your body. Like I was a completely naive 18-year-old. I had no investment in anything, and I was like,
but do you think it was because we were a naive 18-year-old that, with an open mind, shall we say, that there's some sort of psychological element where in the power dynamic between the two, he's the old master, you're the young student. Do you think that the mind creates the sensations that you expect to feel in that situation or something?
No, because in that particular moment, I didn't know what he was going to do or what was going to happen. We had been practicing this sort of no touching thing, so I had some concept of what.
See, someone might say that he prepped you.
You could say that, yeah. But ultimately, I if people want to go that hard into not believing it, that's okay with me. The fact that I think is that we do produce an electromagnetic charge in our body. Like if we have a metabolism, it's running. It's so electrical that you can hook an EKG up to you and watch your heart produce an electrical pulse every time it beats. So why shouldn't there be these little more subtle things that we can feel? The thing is, it's just like a trick you can do. It's not more than that. If anyone says they can throw you over with their chi powers or their electromagnetic field, I'm like, yeah, I'd like to see that proved, but I'm skeptical,
Yeah. I was going to say that you can definitely, I mean, I'm sort of skeptical of anyone who says stuff like that, just because you see so many charlatans doing stuff like that.
Exactly.
But at the same time, when you just relax and put your fingers together like you're holding a ball, you can feel things without connection between the two fingers. So there's something there. I mean, I don't know what it is. Chi, I guess, because it's a word for something that you can only feel but can't see.
Right. And this is where I'm just like, yeah. And so I'm not stressed. It's chi, and that's good enough for me. I don't need more than that. And I'm happy. I'm really with everyone who's skeptical of the people who are doing weird stuff with chi. But and there is a thing, all that stuff happens to people. They convince their people to bounce, and it's kind of
that's
suggestion in your head. And
I've seen a video of people bouncing about, and then everyone gets very upset by it, don't they?
And I just don't get upset about it. I'm like, I believe there's probably something quote unquote real happening there. It's just, it is what it is. It's like a little parlor trick that you can learn to do. It has nothing to do with this martial truth that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. So moving on to Tai Chi.
Yes.
Hung Lu Jian. What were you? You sort of mentioned them before, and they're saying that the problem was the wording. Ward off.
Well, so
gets you actually learning what it is.
Right. So it's like when I started learning Tai Chi with in the 1989 or whatever it was, they they said ward off, roll back, press, and push, right? So pung is ward off, but pung doesn't mean ward off. I mean, pung is a special Tai Chi term that doesn't mean anything to your average Chinese person. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about, So you have to learn what it means in and of itself, not call it ward off. Roll back, again, is li, actually means white in Chinese. And so where do you get roll back from white? Like, it's maybe one technique you can use this concept, this sort of technique is a roll back like motion, but it's only one of many possible ways you could apply it. So you've like limited yourself right away. But then it gets worse because then you get to G, which is squeeze. And this is a term like if you're learning Tuina massage, the technique where you like take someone's muscle and kind of squeeze it is called G, to squeeze. And this is the same term you use when you do the term which we were calling press, right? So it's not a press really, it is literally G. The term in Chinese is literally G, squeeze. So why would you translate it to press when the word is squeeze? Doesn't make sense at all. And then you have push, and push actually means press, and particularly to press downwards, a downward pressing motion. So when you turn that into push, then you have to try to push. Otherwise you can't, like if the technique is called push, then you should be pushing. But the technique isn't really a push. It's this downward pressure that you exert. So right away, if you only have the English in 1990 and you're trying to figure out this form, when you come to press or to G, squeeze, and on press, and you're trying to press and push instead, how can you even start to figure out how to do it properly because you don't even have the right concept, the right word to start with? That's and that's not. Those are some super clear examples, but this translational issues are rife. I mean, again, the Qi is the same kind of thing. It's just Chinese people don't care because they know that Qi kind of means everything and nothing, so they don't get hung up on what it means. But lots of translations are like this, and this is in the medical world. The entire Chinese medicine world is also kind of rife with these kinds of weird misconceptions based on poor. I mean, the example would be the wuxing, right? The 5 phases, 5 elements. It's not an element. That element is not a translation of the term xing. And so how can we think about it properly if we're starting off with this completely erroneous image of what the word means? Boom. Does that make sense?
So it does. I mean, the other 4 parts of Tai Chi, the other 4 energies, which is again probably the wrong word, but one of them is shoulder stroke, and the actual, it doesn't mean anything to your shoulder or something. I remember reading the actual translation of it and thinking it means to lean on something, doesn't it?
To lean, exactly.
Yeah, leaning. There's no mention of shoulder.
No,
but everyone thinks it's a shoulder strike,
Exactly. That's another clear example of exactly what I'm talking about. Yep. And that was the kind of thing that blew my mind when I got enough Chinese in to start to actually look at the words myself. Exactly that. I'm like, wow, it doesn't mean shoulder stroke.
So just stick to the first 4. How would you describe Peng and Liu and Ji and An?
What's it? So Peng, I wouldn't try. I'd just say it's Peng. If you want to understand it, then you have to come and train, and it'll take some time, but you'll build up this concept of what Peng is. Peng is, because Peng is the one that's in everything else too, right?
Yes, it's different, isn't it? Because it's the basis of all the rest of them, isn't it? So it's the fundamental. I don't object to the word bounce occasionally when people say Peng, just because if you run into somebody who has strong Peng, you tend to bounce off them. So I quite like that as a word, but I mean, I don't know.
But and that's totally true. A good Peng produces this, potentially produces a bouncy thing, but my problem there is that the Peng itself is neutral. So you only bounce on it because of the way, if I have a nice Peng and how you...
Yeah, we'd need somebody else, wouldn't it, right, to produce a bounce.
Right, because if you just push cautiously on it, you won't bounce. A different effect will happen.
Yeah, so somebody has to push him with enough force, like a rubber ball.
Exactly.
You've got to push it or punch it hard enough to bounce back. Whereas if you just gently roll it, it just rolls. There's no bounce at all.
Exactly. So Peng, I would have to, I just say it's Peng. And this is, this leads me back to my project there with the Neijing and the medical stuff and tying it in with the physical culture. I'm working on this whole concept of not translating a lot of words, but rather educating people to use the Chinese. So we basically will use qi. Everyone's happy to use qi, even if we're going to argue about what it means, you know. Another one, which I think is getting pretty common and current, is shen, you know, the jing qi shen, the shen, where more and more people are comfortable just talking about shen, because if you translate it to spirit, which is the normal thing to do, it doesn't really mean spirit. And it can give lots of examples from both in literature and my personal experience where Chinese people, what we mean by spirit when we say it in English has no meaning exactly in Chinese. It's one of these cultural disconnects, right?
Yeah.
So there's many words like this, and Peng would be another one. I would just be like, forget trying to translate that. Just
Leave
call
it as Peng. Okay.
Yeah. And then Lu is actually wipe, and that I think it describes pretty good the way the feeling of the technique when you do it well is. So I tend to just call it Lu again, because wipe, it doesn't have it doesn't grab you in English.
Yeah, I'd think of wipe my brow.
Exactly.
It's not. It's more. It's more. I mean, I don't know what you think, but maybe it's more like, it reminds me more of the wax on, wax off of Karate Kid, where he was like doing the like a wave hands like clouds pattern, you know, and you're wiping something as in deflecting it.
Yeah, exactly. And so I would tend to just stick with Lu. And then G is squeeze. So if I'm going to say it in English, it's going to be squeeze. And on is press. But again, press is kind of open-ended. Press or on, I could go either way with those.
Yeah, I mean, it's that sort of heavy downward sink, isn't it? Like, but quite often, if you've brought someone in and sunk them down, the next move, the obvious one, is to push them away, because they're set up for it. So I think that's why in the form it's a push away.
Exactly.
The ad happens first, and then you push them away.
Exactly. And this is a really fun thing to see people kind of discovering. And I mean, for yourself too, like it's really cool when I start to realize that. Again, I couldn't, maybe I could have, but in my life, I didn't ever come to this realization until after I started to realize, like, oh, this is why it doesn't seem right when I get to the push, because it's not a push. You know, like after you on them down, then you can let them go out and it looks like a push, but it's not.
Yeah. If someone's just set up and they're strong and you just push them, that's completely different, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's actually in the the Young Family Standard form, you know, at the end of the first line, you have this one, I think it's called crashing palm or something like that. And that's actual push there that happens, as opposed to the on in the other parts of the form in the grassless bird's tail. So yeah, I was super enthusiastic about this, because what happened to me in the end was that my teacher Vince had passed away, and I said, well, what do I do next now? You know, I was pretty devoted to following his teaching for a long time, and I realized, I had come here to learn Tai Chi, and I learned a little bit. We did some, but mostly I learned Xing and Bagua and a lot about fighting and a lot of medicine too. But I was like, but not that much Tai Chi at all. So I think I'll go back and learn Tai Chi. And so it was only after I did that that I started to find better information, higher quality information about Tai Chi. And then I was like, oh, this explains so much things, like so many things that had just never made sense. Just trying to play your standard 4 directions push hands pattern, but knowing that we're not supposed to push. But then how do we make it work? If I don't push you now, what do I do? You know? And now I have the answers to that. I'm super excited and happy to have found solutions to these riddles.
Yes, this is your Tai Chi teacher, Liang. I've completely forgot his name.
Liang Dehua.
Yes. And this he does it's like an interesting lineage. It's the Sauhao.
Exactly.
So it has got some Yang Fu influence, but I've seen him do the form, and it's pretty different, and it's more interesting is perhaps one way of saying it.
No, I find this is my feeling was, I mean, I wound up with Liang mainly to start out with because of two factors. One was it was all from the internet, and it was all from the pandemic because I was stuck inside my apartment and I wasn't allowed to leave. In my town, there was a heavy lockdown. So I was really in my apartment for a couple of months, and so I watched a lot of internet. And the two things were Liang, his classes. He had videos of his classes, and I was like, those people are having. That's a class I would like to be part of. There's people are laughing and having a good time, but they're also working hard. And sometimes he's hit someone and dumps him on the ground, and everyone laughs. And the guy gets back up and kind of brushes his
like deal, right?
So I was like, that looks good to me. I think I could hang with that. And then there's just hidden in there somewhere, there was a couple of short clips of people doing what I call sanso, which means like pretty freestyle, unscripted, almost like sparring, but not quite. And this is a kind of practice that we do a lot. Again, it's back to Kung Fu and martial arts stuff, but one of the things about traditional arts, I think, that's pretty universal is that you have this respect for the damage that you can do on each other, and everyone needs to go to work tomorrow and keep providing for themselves and their family. So you can't beat the crap out of each other every week. So you have to have these ways of working into it. So we have this way of doing what I call sanso, which I don't see many people doing really that way. And there I saw Liang's people doing it, something very, very similar. I was like, oh, they're doing the same kind of thing as we do. That's cool. So those things convinced me to go and check him out. Actually, the other part of that story is that Vince, my teacher, he had trained this Shenlong Xingyi that we talked about, and was very focused on the martial aspect of things. And then he was traveling in China, and he met a guy named Li Guichang, who is Song Shurong lineage of Xingyi. And that guy, Li Guichang, did something where he used some kind of punch that had no movement in it and knocked someone down. So it's something like some of these cheat tricks that you see people doing. Right? Now, this kind of blew Vince's mind. He was like, how did he do that? And he couldn't figure it out. And so he came back and told us about it, and it was like, this is weird. Like, I don't understand how he did it. So when I saw some of the stuff that I see all the different things with the different Tai Chi peoples around, and I went to that martial camp and checked out the people there. So then when I met Liang Dua, he can do some of those tricks, but he's kind of like, yeah, it's a trick.
Yeah.
And so now, like, try to punch me instead. And they okay, cool, common sense. I'm in. You train this. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not a big fan. I don't like that whole setup of these big seminars of these guys that treat themselves a bit like gurus and have followers, and then they do no touch stuff, and it's like I'm kind of allergic to that whole thing. It just doesn't sit well with me. But like you say, people that just go, well, just try and punch me, that's fine. I'm down with that. That's great.
Exactly. Me as well. And I do, like I said, I have appreciation for some of these chi skill things, but they have to fit in. I view them ultimately, they're like training mechanisms for certain skills, and I think they work for what they're supposed to do, but you can get carried away very, very easily and go off
you can go down the rabbit hole, can't you?
Yeah,
and you can definitely see these big name teachers who've gone down the rabbit hole, and it's just maddening to me. I don't like it.
Yeah, no, I hear you 100%. And so my experience again is that in the end with Liang Dua, I was completely satisfied that we were dealing with common sense and with an enjoyable level of martial truth going on. But as you said, he has a very nice and direct lineage back to Yang Xiaohou. So again, based on all my other experiences with these things, we're talking about all of us are dealing with things that go back about 100 years, right? Like if we go back more, it gets more and more like daft, and we can't really tell. It's all fuzzy. But 100 years ago, 1925 in Beijing, it's there's people that we can relate to. They're not so long dead that they're not people anymore. And with my other teachers, I know kind of I spend a lot of time in Beijing, and I know a lot about the what it feels like with people who are like it's only 2 people removed, from that time.
Yeah.
And so Liang has that kind of flavor. He's that closely connected to it. So it means that his form, for example, is probably pretty close to what Yang Shaohu was doing in 1925, and that to me is very, really pleasing. I view it like a connoisseur, like a wine collector or whatever. I'm like, this is a really nice Tai Chi form. I really
nice vintage.
Yeah, exactly.
I also like his spear work as well. He's using the spear as a training tool, which is, he's not necessarily. I mean, maybe he does fight with the spear. I don't know enough about him. But the video I've seen him do with the spear is talking about how it's, you're projecting to the end of the spear, and that's the purpose of why we do. Like, he had a reason why he was doing it, and it all made sense, and it was logical. And
no, exactly. And Xingyi's got a lot of spear too, right? So
Xingyi's got a lot of spear in it, but it's I mean, the way it is with my teacher, it's spear fighting.
Right.
Like, it's not using the spear as a tool to. That's like a byproduct.
Right. Interesting. That I like the sounds of that. And I was going to say with the spear and the training with it, because I have in the context of Shigi, I have not done a ton of spear techniques or sparring or anything like that, but I've done a lot of exercising with them, and it relates back to something we were talking about earlier a little bit. I had an interesting experience last year where I was ended up with a group of these MMA guys they're pretty, I think, like low level semi-professional kind of. They weren't just weekend people, but they weren't that high level either.
Yeah.
But they're super tough, and I found, reasonably scary guys. But they were both kind of amazed and really bummed about the spear stuff. We showed them the spears, and they just couldn't do it. But they also immediately saw the use of it. They're like, "Holy shit! If I could project like out to the tip of the spear, like what you're doing, imagine how hard my punch would be." They're like, "Wow, this would really work." But wow, I really can't do it. Yeah. And so it was interesting to me to see this crossover. We're always talking about the traditional arts versus MMA and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. So this was a case where without any prompting, these MMA guys immediately saw the utility of the old school way of using the spear.
Yeah. I mean, see, using the spear as a device to project through is one thing, but then if you're fighting with the spear, sword is a lot easier because spears are massive and it's very hard to carry them around anywhere to practice this. But swords are a lot more portable, wooden swords. And what I picked up from my teacher, my Xingyi teacher, with the sword work he did, was how minimal it becomes when it's a weapon. So, because Xingyi, the beauty of it for me is that what you're doing barehand is the same as you do with a sword. It's the same as you do with a spear. Everything's the same, but the amount of movement you do barehand is massive. You don't realize this when you're doing barehand, and you use a sword. You realize it's all much smaller. And then you go to a spear, and it's even smaller still. And the advantage of all this is that when you then go back to barehand, you've got all this room for error that you didn't know existed before. Because with a sword and a spear, if you make a slight angle wrong, you're cut. Whereas with the bare hand, you can get everything wrong and survive. And so that's another aspect of training weapons that I think it's well worth doing because of that, and the speed as well. Like sword's fast, and then when you go back to bare hand, it all feels like you're just going in slow motion again, and it's like, oh, this is so easy now compared to trying to evade a blade.
Yeah, absolutely. I can relate to what you're saying. I think it goes the other way too. The having with your bare hands, still having the idea that it's the encounter is as tight and tricky as with a bladed weapon is, I think, one of the characteristics of the Xingyi. You can't get in there and exchange blows and trade back and forth. It has to be in and out, just as if it was a bladed thing.
Yeah, and also it's not a dueling art. It's for soldiers. And they couldn't spend time dueling. You had to kill that guy because there's another one behind him that's coming at you.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't spend time showing off your technique on somebody. It's just like bang, 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 bang. That was brilliant. I don't think you've sold your online course hard enough. I think you should mention it again.
Okay,
People can sign up for this, can't they? Right?
absolutely they can. And as I say, it's about this idea that the Neijing, this 2,000-year-old book, has a lot of relevance for, obviously, for people like us who are involved with internal martial arts, but actually for anyone interested in a different take on how to see health and well-being and our kind of place in the world. And it's just like what we've been saying. This is sort of new information in that we're getting better and better understanding it. The same as with Peng Lu Jian, we're able to understand what this book is saying better all the time.
Yeah.
And so I just want to participate in this kind of ongoing conversation of bringing this information, this kind of way of seeing the world, to light more and be available to more people who might be interested in it. And the project, the Living Neijing project, is going to be an ongoing thing. There's members, like a private course that you can sign up for, and then we're producing steadily more and more public content and just basically promoting that about this, the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Classic.
Yeah, so you've got translations of it, but you've also got lectures on like parts of it. And so like each week you upload a couple of new bits and bobs, don't you, little videos and things.
Correct. There's both theoretical, like looking at the text and explaining, talking about what the text is saying, and also practical things. Every week there's some more practical stuff, which is basically what we call qigong or neigong, but informed with these ideas, which, as we've been talking about, I believe are where they came from in the first place. So it's not random. And just like with the chi skills, it's not so mystical and esoteric. It's actually really straightforward and practical. And once you understand that part, you can just go at it and use it in any other activity that you're doing, whether it doesn't matter what it is. It's applicable everywhere.
Oh, brilliant. So what's the website address for that again?
It's called Living Neijing Project, or the website is livingneijing.ca.
.ca. Okay.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay. So if anyone wants to sign up, they can sign up there. Well, thank you for reaching out to me. This has been fascinating.
Excellent. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to get out there and talk about it. We're going to show up one day and come visit you guys. I'd like to have a chance to chat with Damon some too and whatnot.
Yeah, if you're ever in Britain, then please drop in.
I will.
Cheers.
Thank you again, Graham.
Bye.
Bye.